Pick that up, sweetheart, assuming you can read the orders. That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 14 minutes before Sergeant Major Robert Vance's heart stopped beating. Cedar Creek Medical in Houston smells like antiseptic and floor wax under buzzing fluorescent lights that never quite stop humming. The ICU corridor stretches 230 feet from the main station to the isolation rooms, and Brooke Sullivan has measured every inch of it 3 times now. She restocks the supply cabinet in room 312, her movements economical, her hands moving with a precision that comes from having done this work in far darker places than fluorescent-lit Texas hospitals. The surgical gloves hide most of it, but her knuckles are scarred, thin white lines that map themselves across her skin like a geography of things she will never explain to anyone who asks. She is 39 years old. She limped slightly on her left leg, a compensation she doesn't even notice anymore. The limp comes from shrapnel that missed her femoral artery by the width of a finger, extracted in a forward operating base in Fallujah by a trauma surgeon whose name she never learned. In her locker downstairs, wrapped in plastic and stacked beneath her spare scrubs, sits a pair of combat boots. The leather is cracked. The laces are still tied from the last time they were worn. She touches them at the beginning of each shift the way other people touch photographs of loved ones. Her brother's name is stenciled on the side in fading black ink, Sullivan, E. 3 weeks. That is how long Brooke Sullivan has worked at Cedar Creek Medical, and she has already identified 17 irregularities in the billing documentation for Surgical Supply Unit BA-17. She hasn't mentioned any of them. She won't. She is not here to audit the hospital's accounting systems. She is here because Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy Special Warfare Medical, received a secure call on a phone that doesn't appear in any carrier database, and that call came from someone with authority to place her anywhere in the continental United States, in any capacity, under any name. The call said 4 words, Room 307. 2 weeks. Protect him. Room 307 contains Sergeant Major Robert Vance. Sergeant Major Vance is recovering from what the chart calls a cardiac event, a sudden arrhythmia during what should have been routine post-op monitoring following a minimally invasive procedure. The surgery was performed by Dr. Marcus Whitfield. The arrhythmia was probably not natural. Naval intelligence suggested it was pharmacologically induced, though the evidence chain was thin enough that no one had filed official complaints. Not yet. That is why Brooke is here, restocking supply cabinets and charting medication administrations with obsessive precision, watching room 307 every time she passes, checking Vance's vitals every 2 hours despite being assigned to the Western Corridor. Sergeant Major Vance commanded her son's unit in Fallujah. His name is in her brother's last message, recorded on a voice memo that Brooke has listened to exactly twice, both times alone in her car. She checks Vance's monitor as she passes. Heart rate 72. Respiratory rate 14. BP 120/80. Normal. Stable. Good. She does not pause. A nurse who lingers on one patient's room draws attention. Attention is the opposite of useful for a Master Chief Petty Officer working undercover in a civilian hospital, and Brooke Sullivan has built her entire adult life on the principle of useful. The supply cart clicks as she pulls it toward room 308. The wheels are old. They squeak. Everything in this hospital seems to belong to the previous decade, older machines, older protocols, older attitudes. She reaches the nurse's station at 11:43 a.m., logged in the system by her badge, 34 minutes before lunch service begins. That is when she notices him watching her. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stands beside the medication dispenser with a chart in his hand and an expression that suggests he has just discovered something unfortunate about his day. He is 6'2", approximately 190 pounds, with the kind of jawline that usually comes with inherited money and a country club membership. His watch is a Rolex Submariner. His shoes are Italian leather. His eyes are the color of weak tea and twice as warm. He introduces himself with a handshake that lasts 2 seconds longer than it should, squeezing just hard enough to test, not hard enough to assault. His grip says, "I am accustomed to winning. I will win this too." "Dr. Whitfield," he says. "You're new." Brooke Sullivan. 3 weeks. Her voice is even. Deferential. The voice of someone accustomed to following chain of command. She has practiced this voice for long enough that it no longer feels like a lie. I've noticed your charting. He releases her hand. Very thorough. Thank you, Doctor. I didn't mean it as a compliment. The words land softly, the way all the most effective insults do. They sit in the air for a moment. Around them, the nursing staff begins moving toward the cafeteria, the shift change that happens at noon every day, the 20-minute window when half the floor clears and the rest scatter across the unit. Whitfield glances toward the exodus, then back at Brooke, and something in his expression shifts. It hardens. The calculation becomes visible. Lunch, he says. I usually eat at my desk. Not today. Come on. It is not a request. Brooke follows him toward the cafeteria anyway, which is the correct decision for a civilian nurse encountering an attending physician. The cafeteria sits in the basement, 2 flights down, where the fluorescent lights are even worse and the smell of industrial cooking replaces the antiseptic. Whitfield gets in line. Brooke follows. He orders a salad and a bottle of water. She reaches for a tray. The knock comes as she balances it on her left hand, a casual swing of his right arm that catches the tray with practiced carelessness. The plastic tips. The contents spill. A sandwich, an apple, a container of yogurt, a plastic cup of coffee scatter across the cafeteria floor in front of the day shift staff, 12 nurses and 4 residents, all of them watching. The room does not go silent immediately. It takes 3 seconds for the conversation to stop, for the realization to travel through the space that something intentional has happened. Oh, Whitfield says, and his voice carries genuine surprise. I'm so sorry. How clumsy of me. Brooke stares at the food on the floor. The apple has rolled under a table. The yogurt container is leaking. Her jaw does not clench. Her hands do not tremble. She kneels down, the limp is slight, barely noticeable when she bends, and begins collecting the debris with the same methodical precision she uses for everything. A nurse from the evening shift offers her a napkin. Brooke nods. Thanks her. Continues cleaning. Let me get you another tray, Whitfield says, already turning back toward the line, his tone suggesting he has already forgotten the incident, as if it was genuinely accidental. But it was not. Brooke knows this because she has spent 23 years recognizing the difference between accidents and strategy, and this was strategy. This was a deliberate test. This was a message delivered in front of witnesses, a public statement that he has established dominance, that her position here is provisional, that she is not welcome. The why is still unclear, but the intention is unmistakable. Whitfield returns with a new tray. She thanks him. They eat in silence. He continues testing her. During afternoon rounds, he hands her a patient chart, room 309, a post-op admit, and deliberately drops it from 6 inches above her head. The chart hits the floor at an angle, paper scattering. She is mid-charting at the station. She hears the impact before she sees it. Her hands go still for exactly 1 beat. Then she stops what she is doing, stands, and retrieves the chart from the floor, gathering the pages in their proper order. Pick that up, sweetheart, Whitfield says, as if she has not already begun moving. Assuming you can read the orders. His voice carries just enough doubt to imply incompetence. The implication lands where it is intended, in front of 2 residents and the charge nurse. Brooke hands him the reassembled chart without making eye contact. She does not defend herself. She does not explain anything. She simply accepts the premise of his contempt, nods slightly, and turns back to her computer. Thank you, Doctor, she says. The words are correct. The tone is appropriate. She sounds like someone who deserves this treatment, someone who understands her place. It is the voice of profound discipline. It is the voice of someone who has learned to translate rage into compliance, who understands that some battles are not won through resistance but through an opponent's own frustration at finding no resistance to oppose. Whitfield stares at her for a moment, perhaps expecting a different reaction, perhaps finding her composure unsatisfying. Then he walks away. At 3:47 p.m., Brooke checks Vance's vitals again. HR-71. RR-14. BP-118-79. Stable. His eyes are open. He is watching the ceiling, his expression the particular blend of boredom and discomfort that characterizes recovery. She does not acknowledge him. A nurse who lingers draws attention. She documents the vitals in the electronic system, timestamps them at 15:19, and moves on to the next room. She sits in her car for 20 minutes after her shift ends, the keys in the ignition, the engine off. Her jaw is clenched. She notices this, a single tightening of the muscle, sustained for perhaps 5 seconds, then released. This is the only visible crack in her composure, the only moment where the effort of not reacting has manifested as physical tension. The combat boots sit on the passenger seat next to her. She does not touch them. She simply sits in the gathering darkness of the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot and breathes, letting her body remember that the cafeteria was not a battlefield, that a drop tray is not a threat, that contempt is not an injury. The phone on her dashboard buzzes. A text message from a number that does not identify itself, subject stable. Remain in position. Additional intel tomorrow. Do not deviate. Brooke does not respond. She never does. She starts the car. The headlights cut through the darkness. She drives through Houston toward the small apartment where her 10-year-old son is waiting for her with homework questions she will help him answer, dinner she will help him prepare, a life she has built in compartments so separate from this one that they rarely overlap. But tonight, sitting in traffic on IE-10, she thinks about Sergeant Major Vance lying in room 307. She thinks about the intelligence report that suggested his cardiac event was induced, engineered by someone inside this hospital system. She thinks about her brother's voice on that recording, saying Vance's name in the last message he ever left. What she does not yet know is that tomorrow, everything changes. The staff meeting room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled of stale coffee and air conditioning that couldn't quite mask the undertone of antiseptic. 20 nurses, 3 residents, and a pair of attending physicians sat in folding chairs arranged in loose rows. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood at the front, his tailored blazer catching the fluorescent light, expensive wool, the kind that whispered money without having to announce it. His smile was the practiced expression of a man who had never encountered a consequence he couldn't outrun. "Our newest addition," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the back where Brooke sat with her hands folded in her lap. "Sullivan. 3 weeks now. I'm willing to bet, and I'll put actual money on this, that she quits within 1 week. Anyone want to take that action?" Laughter rippled through the room. Soft at first, then building. A senior nurse in the third row leaned back in her chair, grinning. A resident near the front exchanged a look with his colleague. Whitfield's smile broadened, feeding on the sound like it was oxygen. Brooke's face remained perfectly still. Her breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't move. But her jaw clenched once, just once, a flash of tension that lasted half a second before she controlled it back into neutrality. Nobody caught it except the attending physician in the corner, who glanced over with mild curiosity before returning his attention to his phone. What Whitfield didn't understand was that he was watching a woman who had sewn a wound shut in darkness while rounds of small arms fire snapped past her head. A woman who had performed emergency surgical interventions in conditions that would have sent him into shock. A woman who had held a dying man's hand for the last 3 minutes of his life and done it without flinching because flinching was a luxury she couldn't afford. His contempt bounced off her like rounds off ceramic plating. The meeting continued for another 12 minutes. Brooke took notes. Standard protocol updates. A new medication ordering system coming in the following month. Weekend staffing requirements. She wrote everything down in the small notebook she kept in her scrub pocket, her handwriting precise and even, the letters perfectly spaced like someone trained in documentation that would hold up in front of a jury. Or a court-martial. 3 days later, she was moving through the cafeteria at 6:27 a.m., early shift, before the breakfast crowd, when the line was short and the noise was manageable. She held her tray with 2 hands, coffee, a single slice of wheat toast, 2 cups of Greek yogurt. Fuel. Nothing more. She had learned long ago to eat for function, not pleasure. Dr. Whitfield came around the corner from the beverage station, and his shoulder caught the edge of her tray with what his expression suggested was complete accident. The tray tipped. Coffee erupted across her scrubs in a spreading brown stain, hot enough to make her skin prickle with sensation but not hot enough to burn. Her toast fell to the linoleum and broke into 3 pieces. The yogurt cups went sliding across her legs, one of them rupturing against the floor with a soft splat. 20 staff members watched. "So clumsy, Sullivan," Whitfield said, his voice pitched high enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Maybe nursing isn't really your calling. These things require a certain level of coordination. A certain level of grace." He stepped over the mess without offering his hand. "You might want to go change before rounds. That's going to stain." Brooke knelt. She picked up each item methodically, her hands completely steady, her breathing controlled through her nose in even 4-count inhales. Her scrubs were wet and cooling against her skin. The coffee was already beginning to set into the fabric in a shape like a coastline. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. She just gathered the pieces and stood with them in her hands, a woman made of bone and regulation. A younger nurse, probably in her 3rd year, started to move toward her, but something in Brooke's posture stopped her. Some quality of absolute self-sufficiency that discouraged help the way a raised hand discourages questions. By 7:15 a.m., Brooke had changed into fresh scrubs from her locker. The incident had taken 17 minutes total from the initial contact to her return to the ICU. She had already filed it away in the part of her mind that stored information without assigning emotion to it. The part trained in compartmentalization. The part that had seen worse. Much worse. That same afternoon, during rounds on the cardiac ward, Brooke reviewed Sergeant Major Robert Vance's chart. He occupied room 307, a single bed with a window view of the parking lot and the Houston skyline beyond it. He was recovering from a cardiac event that had occurred while he was at his home in the medical center district, a massive myocardial infarction that had nearly killed him before the ambulance arrived. According to the official record, his heart had simply failed. These things happened. Stress. Genetics. Bad luck. What naval intelligence suspected was something else entirely. Brooke's eyes moved across the documentation with the precision of someone trained to see what wasn't being said. The inflammatory markers were what caught her first. C-reactive protein elevated at 8.2 milligrams per liter, which was high for day 5 of recovery. Too high. The trajectory didn't match normal post-cardiac healing. The WBC count was climbing instead of trending downward. Neutrophils elevated. Something was triggering an immune response that shouldn't be happening. Then she found the surgical note dated 2 days ago. An exploratory thoracic procedure. Dr. Whitfield had performed it, documenting a need to visualize the pericardium for possible effusion. She pulled the operative report. The language was careful, precise, the kind of language designed to withstand scrutiny. Estimated blood loss minimal. No significant findings. The surgery was closed after direct visualization. Routine. But Vance's latest EKG was different from his preoperative baseline. The ST segment showed changes that suggested trauma to the myocardium. And there was no medical indication for opening his chest. His echocardiogram from 2 days before the procedure had shown no pericardial effusion. No fluid. No problem. She photographed the chart with her phone, a cheap burner that looked identical to every other phone in the break room, except the encryption protocol running underneath. She waited until she was alone in the supply closet, hand steady as she composed the message, "Cardiac trauma documented post-unnecessary exploratory procedure. Patient Vance. Recommend immediate review." The response came back in 30 seconds, the kind of response that only happened when someone was watching for you to maintain cover. Do not intervene unless life-threatening. Naval Intelligence had placed her here because Sergeant Major Robert Vance had commanded a Marine reconnaissance team in Fallujah during Operation Phantom Fury. That unit, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, had stumbled onto something about contractor fraud. Something big enough that 3 members of that unit had died in the past 18 months under circumstances that official reports had sealed with single-word explanations: accident, suicide, natural causes. Men in their early 30s didn't die of natural causes. Her younger brother had been a corpsman in that unit. Petty Officer 2nd Class James Sullivan, who had enlisted when she did, who had chosen medicine instead of combat, who had spent his entire career trying to save lives instead of taking them. He had died in Fallujah during a firefight, and Sergeant Major Vance had carried his body 3 miles through enemy territory with rounds snapping past his head and explosions collapsing buildings around him. Vance had held James while he bled out, had stayed with him until the end because that was the only thing left to do. The boots in Brooke's locker had belonged to James. Worn leather, scuffed at the heels, the laces still knotted from the last time he had tied them. She had kept them for 7 years. This wasn't just a mission. This was family. Dr. Whitfield intercepted her near the medication dispensary at 2:33 p.m., his timing too precise to be coincidental. He had been watching her. His voice came cold and low, pitched for her ears only. "You seem awfully interested in a patient who isn't yours. That kind of boundary violation can cost you your license, Sullivan." She turned to face him, her expression neutral as a stone. Around them, the hallway hummed with the ordinary sounds of Cedar Creek Medical, monitor beeps from open rooms, the distant overhead paging system calling for laboratory staff, the squeak of a stretcher's wheels on freshly waxed linoleum. "Patient Vance is receiving cross-coverage," Brooke said, her voice without inflection. "I'm monitoring vital trends." "You're snooping." His smile was the smile of a man who believed himself untouchable. "That's a different thing entirely. Nurses don't make medical decisions. They follow orders. That's the hierarchy. That's how this works. I'd hate to see you compromise your career before it really starts." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning dressed up like concern. The kind of power play that worked when the person being threatened had something to lose. What Whitfield didn't know was that Brooke had already lost everything that mattered. What remained was only duty and the echo of a voice on an old recording, Sergeant Major Vance's voice, calling out her brother's name in the darkness of a Fallujah street, asking the corpsman to stay awake, stay with him, don't you dare close your eyes. "I understand, Doctor," she said. She turned back to the medication dispenser. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her face revealed nothing. But that night, she sat in her car in the hospital parking garage for 20 minutes with her eyes closed, her fingers pressed against the steering wheel so hard that the leather creaked. The air in the car was stale and warm. Outside, the Houston heat pressed against the windows like something living. She had been trained to compartmentalize stress, to store emotional response in a lockbox and get back to work. She had been trained by people who specialized in making warriors out of humans, and the training held. But her hands shook slightly as she drove home. Her 10-year-old son was waiting at the kitchen table when she walked through the door, his backpack still on his shoulders, his homework spread in front of him. He looked up, his face brightening the way children's faces do when a parent comes home. "How was your day?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Good." "Busy?" "The usual." She started making dinner with chicken and rice and vegetables chopped into small pieces, because her son preferred them that way. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of preparation, opening the refrigerator, removing ingredients, setting them on the counter. Her hands shook slightly as she began chopping, the knife moving through a bell pepper with a sound like bones cracking. What she did not yet know was that tomorrow afternoon, Sergeant Major Robert Vance's heart would do something it had no medical reason to do. What she did not yet know was that Dr. Whitfield had already begun making phone calls to board members, had already filed preliminary complaints through back channels, had already set in motion the machinery of institutional power that he believed would bury her before she could bury him. What she did not yet know was that those boots in her locker would soon become evidence. The monitor alarm screamed at 03 for 2 hours. Room 307. The kind of sound that turns hospital corridors into war zones. Brooke was in the break room when it started, stale coffee going cold in her hands, her brother's boot sitting in her locker 3 floors below, the weight of Whitfield's threats hanging somewhere between her ribs and her spine. The alarm cut through everything. Ventricular fibrillation. The sound of a heart trying to kill itself. She didn't run. Running means panic. Running means civilian. She moved. The corridor tile was still wet from the 2,300-hour cleaning. Her shoes found traction without asking. 3rd floor. Room 307. Sergeant Major Vance's room. The man who'd held her brother's hand while he bled out in Fallujah for years and 3 months ago, now lying in a bed at Cedar Creek Medical in Houston, Texas, at the exact moment his heart decided to stop. 2 residents were already there. A respiratory therapist. Neither of them had activated the crash cart. Neither of them had moved. They stood at the foot of the bed like med students watching a recorded lecture, processing, calculating, standing. The heart monitor was screaming in that electronic register that sounds like someone had recorded pain and turned it into a frequency. Vance's eyes were open. Conscious deterioration. Seconds remaining. Brooke crossed the room. 3 steps. She didn't announce herself. She didn't say, "Excuse me," or "I'll just," she simply existed in the space where action was needed, the way bodies do when the thinking part of the brain has already stopped negotiating and the muscle memory has already won. "Crash cart," she said. One of the residents blinked. "We're calling. Now." The word had weight. The word had command. The word had carried Marines through ambushes in the Jolan district, and the resident heard something in it that overrode protocol, overrode hierarchy, overrode whatever medical school had taught him about nurse versus doctor boundaries. He moved. The respiratory therapist moved. The crash cart was in the room in 7 seconds. Vance's monitor showed the kind of rhythm that meant irreversible damage was accumulating in 14-second intervals. Brain death approached like an unwanted guest who was already crossing the threshold. Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway at the exact moment Brooke was checking the defibrillator pads. He was on his phone. Mid-call. His voice carried across the room like diesel exhaust. She was alone with him before the code. "We need to document exactly what interventions were performed. Not asking for medical assistance. Documenting. Building a case in real time while his patient's cerebral cortex was dying." The defibrillator charged. 200 joules. The sound of it, that whine that had no equivalent in civilian life, that high-frequency escalation that meant electricity was pooling in a machine that existed only to restart hearts. Brooke had heard that sound before. She had heard it in a forward operating base 30 kilometers from Fallujah while keeping pressure on a lance corporal's femoral artery with one hand and reaching for an ammo can with the other. "Clear," she said. "Not everybody clear. Not I'm going to defibrillate. Just the essential word." The resident stepped back. Whitfield was still talking to someone on the phone. His hand was making notes on the chart. Documenting. Always documenting. The defibrillator discharged. Vance's body convulsed. The monitor showed asystole for a moment, that flat line that looks like surrender, and then something changed. A rhythm emerged. Not normal. Not even close to normal. But organized. Electrical activity returning to the muscle like refugees finding their way home. "He's got output," the respiratory therapist said. The kind of statement that meant the next 60 seconds mattered more than any other 60 seconds would. But Vance's chest wound, the one from Whitfield's unnecessary exploratory procedure, the one that had no legitimate surgical indication, the one that had opened his pericardium and chest cavity for no reason except that Whitfield had been paid $40,000 that month by a medical supply company to maximize billable procedures. That wound was beginning to fail. The sutures were separating. The sternum incision, never properly approximated, never meant to hold under the strain of a code, was beginning to dehiss. Blood welled up from the incision like something with intention. "We have a wound separation," one of the residents said. "Young. Trained. Frozen. That's catastrophic. We need to go to the OR. We need a cardiothoracic surgeon. Now." Whitfield was still on the phone. Still documenting. The nurse initiated compressions without waiting for physician direction. "I witnessed this. We'll need to file an incident report." His words were precise. Legal. Predatory. He was building something. The blood kept coming. Not a ooze. Not a concerning amount. A betrayal of the entire anatomy underneath the skin, hemorrhaging from the incision where Whitfield's greed had made an unnecessary path. The heart rate was climbing. Vance's body understood what his mind couldn't process anymore. The blood was leaving. The nearest cardiothoracic surgeon was at Hermann Memorial, 18 minutes away by ambulance. Vance had 3 minutes before the blood loss crossed the line from recovery to damage to death. Mathematics had entered the room and was doing arithmetic on a human being. Brooke looked at Vance's open chest. She looked at the incision. She looked at the sutures that shouldn't have existed. She looked at the man who had wrapped her brother's body in a poncho and carried him through an alley in Fallujah so that his body would be treated with dignity, and she made the calculation that all field medics make the moment they realize the next decision is the one that determines whether someone lives or dies by their hand versus dies by someone else's incompetence. "I need a field setup," she said. Her voice had changed. The residents heard it. Whitfield heard it on the phone. The respiratory therapist heard it. The voice that emerged from her throat was not the voice of the quiet nurse restocking supplies in the ICU. It was command tone. It was the voice that had called out coordinates in Fallujah while maintaining pressure on an artery with one hand and signaling for medical support with the other. It was the voice of someone who had run codes in buildings that were still being shelled. "Set up," one of the residents said. "Set up for what?" Brooke was already reaching for the surgical tray. Trauma shears. Stainless steel, cold enough to feel like waking. She had hands that had held together things that were supposed to fall apart. She had hands that had closed wounds in forward operating bases where the nearest CT scan was a helicopter ride away and the nearest blood bank was whatever the corpsman could spare from his own veins. "Direct cardiac access," she said. "Open field resuscitation. I need a size 4.0 suture, a satin sky clamp, and 1 milligram epinephrine ready to push for." She wasn't asking. The voice came from somewhere else. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere that predated Cedar Creek Medical and civilian medicine and the fiction of being a new hire. Whitfield's voice on the phone had stopped. The silence was the kind that follows when someone realizes they've been standing in a room with a power source they didn't know existed. He was still holding the phone. Still documenting. But his hand had stopped moving. One of the residents said, "Who are you?" Brooke was already opening Vance's surgical field. The shears cut through the sutures with a sound like something fundamental breaking. She moved like muscle memory had already won, like her hands knew the way through a human chest the way most people knew the way home. The pericardium was already compromised. The blood was already there. The heart was already visible, the way it only becomes visible when the human body stops being a closed system and starts being a trauma scene. "Cardiac output," she said. "Weak," the respiratory therapist said. "Weakening." Vance's blood pressure was 72/38. His heart rate was climbing toward 120. The oxygen saturation was dropping 92, 90, 87. The kind of cascade that happens when the body realizes it's running out of time. "Push the epi," Brooke said. 1 milligram for now. Repeat every 3 to 5 minutes. She was already moving toward his chest with her hand positioned for direct cardiac massage. The incision was open wide enough now. The ribs were exposing themselves. The heart lay there the color of old meat, beating weakly, and her hand moved into position like this was the 1,000th time she'd done it instead of the first time in a civilian hospital where the rules were supposed to matter. The moment her hand entered Vance's chest and made contact with the muscle, the entire room changed. Whitfield had hung up the phone. He was staring at her with the expression of someone watching a known quantity suddenly become something unknown. The residents had stopped moving. Even the monitors seemed to hold their breath for a moment as her hands began the rhythm, compression, release, with a precision that no amount of civilian CPR certification could teach. Sinus rhythm, the respiratory therapist said. His voice was strange. Awed. Terrified. We have sinus rhythm. Brooke's jaw was moving. She was still calling out protocols. Still speaking in medical terminology that was correct but flavored with something that tasted like military dosing protocols, something that sounded like someone who had run codes in places where the ceiling was concrete and the floor was blood and the only thing between success and failure was whether your hands remembered the work they'd been trained to do. That's when she caught herself. She'd said push 1 milligram epi, but she'd used the military protocol rate, the dosing standard for tactical field medicine, the approach that soldiers used when surgeons weren't available and dying was the only alternative. That wasn't Cedar Creek Medical protocol. That wasn't civilian standard. That was Fallujah. That was forward operating bases. That was the kind of medical knowledge that only lived in bodies that had been trained by the Navy to keep other bodies alive in circumstances where civilian medicine didn't exist. Whitfield's hand moved to his phone again. Not to call for assistance. To document. The moment she realized her cover had just fractured, he was building the statement. The written record. The evidence. But Vance's heart was maintaining rhythm now. The chest wound was controlled. The blood loss was slowing. The oxygen saturation was climbing, 89, 92, 94, and somewhere in the mathematics of the human body, the moment between death and survival had shifted by something smaller than a breath but larger than a prayer. The oxygen saturation was climbing, 89, 92, 94, and somewhere in the mathematics of the human body, the moment between death and survival had shifted by something smaller than a breath but larger than a prayer. Brooke's hands moved on their own. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Just muscle memory running deeper than consciousness, muscle memory that had been forged in a hospital tent outside Fallujah where the sand never stopped blowing and the supply line never brought enough blood. She widened the surgical field with 2 decisive movements, her fingers finding the retractors with the certainty of someone who had done this before when it mattered more. The resident stepped back. Nobody questioned her. Nobody spoke. They simply watched as the new nurse with the steady hands opened a man's chest wider and reached inside. Direct cardiac massage. Hands inside a human thorax. Her palms against the muscle that had been trying to die, that had stopped believing in its own rhythm, that had surrendered to the mathematics of electrical failure. She began to compress. Not the frantic motions of panic. Precise compressions. Controlled. Methodical. The kind of precise that came from having held lives together in conditions where precision meant the difference between a body going home or staying in the desert. Epi 1 milligram 4 push. Atropine 0.5. Get me calcium chloride 10%, 1 gram bolus. The words came out in a voice that didn't sound like the quiet nurse who restocked supplies. The residents froze for half a second, then moved. Nobody asked who had given the orders. The authority in those words was the kind that transcended hierarchy, the kind that came from somewhere older than hospital protocols. Ventilate on my count. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. She called it out like she was in a trauma bay in Anbar Province instead of an air-conditioned ICU in Houston. Her hands continued their work inside his chest cavity, her fingers performing direct cardiac massage with the precision of a surgeon, of a medic, of someone who had done this 17 times under fire with nothing but field gear and adrenaline and the absolute knowledge that stopping meant a Marine would die. 30 seconds. 45. Vance's heart remained in fibrillation. Push the epi. Her voice didn't crack. Charge to 360. Clear. The defibrillator paddles discharged through his heart. The body arched. Nothing. 2 minutes. Her hands never stopped their rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they had all the time in the world. One of the residents was reading off vital signs, blood pressure still dropping, oxygen sat improving but the rhythm still erratic, and Brooke's hands kept moving, kept compressing, kept doing the work that the heart had abandoned. Push another epi. 1 milligram. 3 minutes. The ICU monitor showed a faint, irregular pattern beginning to organize itself. Not yet. Not enough. Her hands continued their precise compressions, her body moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had learned medicine in a place where the textbooks didn't cover half the casualties. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The heart converted. Sinus rhythm. The monitor traced out the beautiful, impossible line of a man who was supposed to be dead learning to live again. Brooke withdrew her hands, stepped back, and the surgical team that had been sprinting down the corridor from upstairs finally arrived to a patient who had already been saved by someone they would spend the next 6 hours trying to understand. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Residents calling out vitals. Nurses establishing central lines. The attending surgeon taking over, asking rapid questions about the arrest, the timeline, the medications. Brooke stood with blood on her scrubs to the wrists, breathing steadily, her face perfectly composed while her heart performed its own violation inside her ribs. Dr. Whitfield stood in the doorway, watching. His expression had changed in the space of a heartbeat. The calculation in his eyes was no longer curious. It was predatory. It was the look of a man who understood he had just witnessed something that threatened everything he had built, everything he had hidden, everything he had rationalized away as he accepted his $40,000 monthly in kickbacks from a medical supply company while a covert operative stood 6 feet away, documenting every irregularity, every billing fraud, every unnecessary procedure. She could feel his stare like a physical thing. She didn't look at him. She simply began removing her gloves, her movements economical, her jaw set in that line it had held since she arrived at Cedar Creek Medical 3 weeks ago. Within the hour, Dr. Whitfield had made 5 phone calls. The first went to the hospital board president at 05 for 5 hours. "We have a significant compliance issue." The new RN in the ICU, Sullivan, performed an unauthorized surgical intervention on a post-operative patient. She opened a chest cavity without attending physician oversight. Possibly diverted medications. I have concerns about her background. The second went to the chief nursing officer at 0552. Need to escalate immediately. Medication discrepancies in the ICU. Multiple witnesses. Sullivan was the primary nurse on the shift. I'm filing an incident report. The third went to Dr. Lawrence Chen, the state nursing board investigator and a favor Whitfield had been holding for 3 years, at 0601. I have a referral. Nurse with questionable credentials. Possible controlled substance diversion. Unauthorized practice. I'd recommend a formal investigation. The fourth and fifth went to the 2 nursing references Brooke had listed, one from her previous assignment in San Diego, one from a temporary position in Seattle. To both, Dr. Whitfield explained that the hospital was conducting a compliance audit and had discovered potential medication discrepancies during Brooke's tenure. He asked, very carefully, whether they had ever observed any concerning behaviors. The first reference, confused and professional, said no. The second, a nurse manager who had never particularly liked Brooke, said she remembered some unusual questions about medication access and that Sullivan had kept to herself quite a bit. That was enough. By 0515, the hospital's security chief was notified. By 0520, 2 security officers were walking toward the ICU. By 0530, they were asking Brooke to come with them to the administrative office. Her badge was confiscated. A suspension letter was placed in front of her by an HR representative who would not meet her eyes, citing pending investigation into medication irregularities and unauthorized practice and immediate administrative suspension pending findings. Brooke read the letter with the same composure she had maintained while her hands were inside a man's chest. She didn't argue. She couldn't argue. Explaining her medical background meant exposing that she was Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, Navy Special Warfare Medical, deployed undercover on an NCIS counterintelligence operation to protect a Marine who had led her son's unit in Fallujah. One word of defense would compromise the operation, would expose the mission, would pull her out before she had finished what she came to do. So she said nothing. She handed over her badge. She was escorted out by security at 0535 with the hospital's legal liability carefully protected and her own classified status burning like a wound she couldn't acknowledge. She drove home in the scrub still stained with Vance's blood. At 0630 hours, her 10-year-old son found her at the kitchen table. She was still wearing the scrubs. The overhead light was off. The only illumination came through the window where the Houston dawn was beginning to separate itself from the dark, and in that light, Brooke Sullivan sat with her hands folded in front of her and a pair of worn combat boots clutched against her chest. The boots were mud brown. The soles were worn through on one heel. The leather was creased in ways that only decades of being walked in could create. The laces were black paracord because the original laces had been cut out of a pair of boots belonging to a Marine named Daniel Sullivan, her brother, who had died in Fallujah in the arms of Sergeant Major Robert Vance while carrying 3 wounded men to a medevac. Tears ran down Brooke's face. Not the crying of someone broken. The tears of someone whose composure had finally, in the absolute privacy of a kitchen, acknowledged what her hands had done and what had been done to her in return. "Mom." Her son's voice was small in the darkness. "Why are you home early?" She couldn't answer. The words were classified. The truth was sealed. The only thing she could do was hold the boots that had belonged to a man who had died because he was brave, and she could sit in the dark, and she could cry like the men who had trained her had taught her to cry, silently, completely, with nothing left over for anyone else's understanding. Outside, Houston was waking up. The traffic on the highways was beginning to thicken. The sun was rising over a city that had no idea that one of its hospitals had just fired the most decorated special operations medic in the United States Navy, or why, or what would happen next. The secured ambulance pulled into Cedar Creek Medical's bay at 08 for 7 hours, its movements deliberate and slow like a predator circling prey it already owned. The guards moved first, federal marshals in dark suits, their presence turning the receiving area into something that felt less like a hospital and more like a detention facility with better lighting. The patient they wheeled out was thin, scarred, his wrists bearing the marks of years spent in places that didn't appear on any map. His name wasn't written on the chart yet. The chart said, "Protected witness, do not disclose identity." Brooke Sullivan stood in the ICU vestibule restocking the crash cart, her movements mechanical and hollow. She'd worn her scrubs from her apartment, the civilian ones, because the dress whites in her car felt like a uniform she no longer had the right to wear. The boots, her brother's boots, remained in the back seat, untouched since the moment security had escorted her from the building 8 hours earlier. She didn't look up as the marshals passed. She didn't need to. Her job was over. Her mission was compromised. Her clearance was probably already revoked. But muscle memory doesn't check email. When the patient entered the ICU, something in her periphery shifted. A frequency she recognized. The way he moved, careful, measured, with the precision of someone who'd learned medicine in dark places where textbooks didn't exist. His eye swept the room with tactical assessment. Then they found her. And stopped. He stared at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the gravel of 40 years and the particular weight of a man who'd survived things that shouldn't have left survivors. "Al-Malik al-Azraq," he said. Not a question. A confirmation. The Blue Angel. The call sign whispered in Fallujah among men who'd watched a female medic move through fire zones with the calm of someone already dead inside, already sacrificed, already belonging to something larger than fear. The room went dead silent. Every monitor, every ventilator, every breath caught in collective recognition. Brooke didn't move. Didn't blink. Her hands remained on the cart, one gloved palm flat against the handle of the defibrillator. She could feel the weight of the entire unit turning toward her like a single organism suddenly aware that prey was standing in front of it the entire time. Then Officer James Halloway, 62 years old, former Navy corpsman, decorated in 3 wars, stood up from the security desk. His voice came out low and steady, the kind of voice that had called in 9-line medevacs under fire. "That's what they called her in Fallujah," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. Just to the room. Just to the truth. Master Chief Sullivan. Al-Malik al-Azraq. That's what the Marines called her when she carried her wounded out of Jolan district under direct fire." The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, indifferent. Within 53 minutes, a Pentagon liaison arrived with a Marine brigadier general whose presence seemed to compress the air itself. They didn't enter through the normal channels. They came directly to the conference room where the hospital board sat with their legal counsel and their calculated comfort. The brigadier general carried a folder marked "Eyes Only, Special Access Required." He opened it without preamble. "Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Marie Sullivan," he began, and his voice moved like a command, like muscle memory made audible. "Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. 2 years embedded with 5th Marine Regiment as primary combat medic. 3 Navy Crosses. 2 Purple Hearts. 17 combat surgeries performed under active fire. Classified medical interventions across 8 separate operations in the Anbar province, 2004 through 2006. He paused. "Let that weight settle. Her charting in your ICU flagged billing fraud totaling over $2.6 million across 18 months. She did that while maintaining perfect documentation standards that, I can assure you, exceed military protocol." The CEO's face had gone pale. The board president stared at the folder as if it might suddenly announce that gravity had been repealed. "There's more," the brigadier general said. And then Sergeant Major Robert Vance, Marine, slowly awake now, was wheeled into the conference room by a floor nurse. His chest still bore the marks of Whitfield's unnecessary surgery, the sutures that Brooke had had to open with her own hands to save his life. His eyes found Brooke's across the room and held them like an anchor. "This woman," Vance said, his voice rough and steady as granite, "carried my Marines through fire zones that intelligence said would drop any of us where we stood. She moved through Fallujah like she was already accepted into heaven and was just waiting to collect the rest of us on her way up. When my brother," his voice cracked once, caught, steadied, when Lance Corporal Tyler Vance took a round through the abdomen in the Jolan district, Master Chief Sullivan held his hand while he died. And then she kept moving. Kept saving the others. She wore his boots through that mission because she said someone needed to carry him forward." The silence in the room was the kind that makes you think about time stopping. About moments becoming permanent. About words becoming the only things that still matter. "She saved my life twice," Vance continued. "Once in Fallujah when she chose to keep moving instead of breaking. Once here when she reached into my chest and restarted my heart with her bare hands." He looked directly at the board president. "The man you were listening to, the one who convinced you she was dangerous, was committing federal fraud with every breath he took. And the only reason you know it is because she charted every single irregularity with military precision." The board president turned slowly toward the external investigator. The man who Whitfield had hired specifically to destroy Brooke. The investigator stood, his laptop already open. While investigating the alleged medication discrepancies, he said, his tone carrying the particular weight of someone who'd just discovered something that changed his whole understanding of a case, "I examined the complete pharmaceutical and supply logs for the ICU. Dr. Whitfield billed Medicare for procedures using equipment and supplies that were never logged as used. Because they were never performed." He turned the laptop. Numbers appeared on screen like indictment. Gulf Medical Supply Corporation. An LLC registered to Dr. Whitfield's wife. $43,000 monthly in payments for 18 months. The equipment was billed to patients. The equipment was never actually used. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood abruptly. His chair scraped backward against tile with a sound like violation itself. "This is absurd. I brought you here to investigate her." "You brought me to investigate," the investigator said quietly, "a nurse whose documentation is so thorough, so precise, that it caught everything you were doing. Master Chief Sullivan's charting is the most meticulous I've reviewed in 20 years of federal investigations. Every supply logged. Every medication documented. Every procedure verified. Military precision. That precision is what exposed you. The FBI arrived 38 minutes later. 2 agents in dark suits, carrying warrants that felt heavier than ordinary paper. Dr. Marcus Whitfield was read his rights in the same conference room where he'd orchestrated Brooke's termination. His face went the color of institutional walls. The state board representative on the call, yes, they patched her in, because Medicare fraud is federal and moves faster than weather, suspended his medical license effective immediately. The hospital CEO terminated his privileges by phone while the FBI agents watched. As security escorted Whitfield toward the exit, he passed Brooke in the hallway. She stood motionless, wearing her dress white uniform now. She'd retrieved it from her car, from the back seat where the boot still rested. Her Navy Cross ribbon bar caught the light above her pocket. 3 medals in ascending order, the most prestigious last. She said nothing. Her face showed nothing at all. She simply watched him pass, and the way she watched him, with the absolute absence of emotion, the complete erasure of reaction, was somehow more devastating than any words could have been. That wasn't anger. That was the look of someone watching a stain being cleaned from a surface she'd already forgotten about. 6 months later, the boots came out of Brooke's closet. She was standing at her son's high school, dressed in her whites, her medals pinned precisely over her left pocket. The Navy Cross ribbon in its proper place. 2 purple hearts below it. Sergeant Major Vance stood beside her in his marine dress blues, his decorations equally precise. The gymnasium was filling with students who had no idea they were in the presence of 2 people who'd walked through fire and chosen to survive it. A student raised her hand. "What made you become a nurse after being a combat medic?" Brooke's eyes moved to the table beside her, where the worn boots were displayed. Next to a photograph of her brother, Tyler, in dress blues, the way he would be forever. 23 years old. Fallujah, 2005. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said quietly. Her voice carried differently now, not deferential, not hiding. Just true. Just real. Just hers. You carry that forward. You honor it by not wasting it. After the presentation ended, after the students filed out with that particular quiet that comes from understanding something real, Brooke's son wrapped his arms around her waist. He was 15. He understood now why she'd kept those boots. Why she couldn't explain. Why some silences were louder than any words. "I get it now, Mom," he whispered. That night, Brooke placed the boots back in her closet, next to her dress whites. The leather was still stained with sand from Fallujah. The laces were still the ones her brother had tied. For the first time in a decade, when she touched them, she didn't cry. She just remembered. And remembering, she realized, was enough. Dr. Marcus Whitfield taught CPR certification classes at Houston Community College, earning $14 an hour, his medical license permanently revoked, facing federal fraud charges that would proceed through the court system with all the weight that federal warrants carry. Cedar Creek Medical implemented new oversight protocols and a multi-department review board. The hospital published a statement about their commitment to transparency and protecting their nursing staff from retaliation. Nobody said her name in that statement. They didn't need to. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, if you've ever been silenced when you should have been heard, if you've ever wondered whether truth eventually finds its way to the surface, subscribe and hit that notification bell. And leave a comment. Have you ever stood next to someone and not realized you were standing next to a hero? Because they're out there. And sometimes they're restocking your supplies in the ICU.